Hello, I'm Mr. Matt, and today we're going to be starting a new series of courses. What I'm going to be trying to do here is I'm going to be taking the entire AP Statistics curriculum that is being introduced in 2026 here, the 2026 to 2027 school year, and I'm going to be starting from the very beginning, and I'm going to go topic by topic and go through each of these and try and give you a very basic course. It's going to cover every single thing you need to know, every single thing that is in the curriculum. But I'm not going to go overboard into other details. I'm just going to keep it very streamlined so that you know everything you need to know in order to pass the AP exam that will be offered in 2027 for the first time. So we're going to begin today with topic 1.1, and this video will be about that topic, and then the next video will be about topic 1.2, and so on. So some of the videos will be pretty short. Some of the videos might be a little bit longer depending on how much content is in each topic, but I am going to try and keep things as simple as possible, get all of the necessary information to you so that you can pass and get a 5 on the AP Statistics exam. So if you pay attention to this course and you understand everything that I say, and if you go through all the practice that we do, you should be in a good position to ace that exam. So we're going to begin now with topic 1.1, introducing statistics. What can we learn from data? All right, and we're going to look at this first term here. The first term is statistical study. A study in which data is collected from a sample to answer an investigative question about a larger population. Okay, so what I want you to notice here is that there are a couple of words that I have highlighted in italics: sample and population. We're going to get to those words later. All right, so don't worry too much if you don't know exactly what those mean. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But let's look at what it says here. It says we're going to be trying to answer some sort of investigative question. So here's an example of the type of investigative question you might see or that you might think of. What is the average height of all the adults residing in Beijing, China? Okay, that's a pretty simple question. All right, but it's a question that is actually, if you think about it, it's impossible for us to answer. We cannot answer this question completely. Think about all the things you might need to do in order to answer this question. You would need to contact all of the adults residing in Beijing, China. That's like 19 million adults. That's pretty much impossible to do. You would have to measure the heights for all of those adults. And then you would have to calculate the average. You would have to add all those heights together and divide by the total number. It's just impossible for us to collect all of this data. And that's one thing that you need to understand about statistics, is the investigative question that we are going to be looking at in statistics. These questions are always questions that are actually impossible to get a complete and totally accurate answer to. Okay, so we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But let's look at another word, datum or datum. All right, and this is the singular form of a word that you are probably more familiar with, which is data. All right, datum or datum is just one piece of information about an item, a place, a person, all right? So that's what a datum is. And when we have a lot of it, we say this is data, all right? We have a lot of data, all right? So what is a data set or a data set? It's a collection of data, all right? So we have a lot of data together. So let me show you an example of a data set. All right, so here we have a data set, a collection of data. And in this data set, we have individuals and we have information, pieces of information about those people, about those individuals. For example, here we have someone named Li Wei, and we can see that this person is 34 years old and 178 centimeters tall. All right, so notice that the data describes this individual. All right, this individual is 34 years old. This individual is 178 centimeters. And that's something that is always going to be true in a data set in statistics, is that these data, these individual datum are describing individuals. So we have Wang Cao here is 26 years old. Okay? So that's very important to understand. Now, let's move on. We're going to come back to this data set in just a moment. But let's look down here. We have another thing. We have another word, variability or variation. And this word is going to be very important as we move forward in statistics. We're going to be talking a lot about variability and variation in data and how to measure it and things. But what does it mean? Well, it just means that anytime we are looking at the value of some piece of information that describes an individual, then that value can take on different amounts for each individual. For example, Wang Cao is 26 and Li Wei is 34. Huang Kai is 175 centimeters and Sun Qi here is 172 centimeters. So the values are changing for each individual. That's what we call variation or variability in the data, okay? So that's another important thing that we need to understand when we're talking about data. Now, remember up at the beginning when we talked about what is a statistical study, we said it's a study in which data is collected from a sample to answer an investigative question about a larger population. Now, I said we're going to come back to those words in a moment, so let's do that now. So what is a population? In statistics, whenever we talk about a population, we're talking about all of the places, all of the things, all of the people that we are interested in. So in our original investigative question that we mentioned at the beginning here, what is the average height of all of the adult residents in Beijing, China? Well, the population in that example would be all of the adult residents in Beijing, China. That's the population. Those are all of the individuals that we are interested in. Okay? Those are all items or individuals of interest in the question. Now, it's important that in statistics, we never have all of the data for a population. If we did, then we don't really need to do a statistical study. Statistical studies are only used when we can't collect all of the data for a population. If I am only interested in the average height of the people in my family, well, I can just measure the few people in my family. I can measure their heights, or I can ask them their heights, collect that data, and find the average. And then our investigative question is answered and over. There's no need to do a statistical study in that example because I can gather data from the entire population of interest. But in this example that we've been talking about, where our population is all of the adult residents in Beijing, China, well, that's different. I can't answer that question completely because I can't gather data from the entire population. In that case, we need to do a statistical study. Okay. Now, in statistics, there are some symbols that we often use to represent pieces of information. And one of those symbols that we use is N, capital N. All right. Capital N represents the size of a population. So, for example, I know that there are estimated about 19.2 million adult residents in Beijing. So that means that N would equal 19.2 million. Okay? Forgive my ugly handwriting. Okay, so we have N equals 19.2 million. That's the population size. N, capital N, is the population size. Okay. Now, another thing, since we can't obtain data from the entire population, well, we need to get some data. So what we usually do is we collect data from a sample. A sample is just a subset of the population from which we collect our data. So we might select 10 people, like these 10 people up here in our data set here, and I collect data from them. And these 10 people make up my sample, and I have their heights right here. And maybe I can use data from the sample to make some sort of conclusion about the population. And that's really one of our big goals in statistics that we will be working towards throughout this course. Now, as I said earlier, we do use some symbols to often represent information. So another symbol that we use is lowercase n. So big N represents the population size. Little n represents the sample size. So since our sample here, we collected data from 10 adult residents. So in that case, what we would do is we would just write n equals 10. All right. So n equals 10. I'm sorry about this little scribble here. All right, n equals 10. So that is our sample size. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about in this section, in topic 1.1, is what's called the investigative process. Now, the investigative process, we typically break it up into 4 steps. The first thing we do, and it's important that this is the first thing we do. The order here is important. The first thing is that we propose an investigative question. For example, what is the average height of all adult residents in Beijing, China? That is an investigative question. So that is something we are interested in figuring out. We want to get an answer for. Okay, next thing we do is we collect some data. Now, again, we probably won't be able to collect data from the entire population. So what we do is we collect data from a sample. So we collect some data, our required data. That's step 2. The third step, which we will get into more later, is analyzing the data. We will learn many ways to analyze data, but we will describe it using numbers. We will graph it on tables and charts. And then the final thing we're going to do is we are going to look at this analyzed data, look at these descriptive numbers and charts, and we're going to use that information to make some conclusions. And we're going to interpret the results of our data in context of our question. Okay, so those are the 4 steps of the investigative process, and we will get more detailed into these as we go through this course. But this is just a little bit of an overview. Now, it's very important that we make sure we got the order correct here. The first thing is we propose an investigative question. One thing that we want to make sure that we avoid in statistics is we never want to get data, look at the data, and then come up with some sort of question or idea to fit that data. That's not good statistical practice. Good statistical practice is first get a question, then collect data, and then analyze it and interpret the data. Okay, so we want to make sure we get that order down correctly. Okay, now the last thing we're going to do here is at the end of each topic, I'm going to give a couple of questions that are similar to questions that you might see on an AP exam in the multiple choice section. So let's look at this first question here. It says, an agricultural scientist measures the yield of 40 corn plants grown in the same field with the same amount of water and sunlight. Which of the following best describes the statistical concept of variation in this study? Okay, so which of these is a description of variation? Is it A, variation accounts for the fact that the scientist will likely make measurement errors when recording the yield? Well, that might be true, but that's not what variation is. Variation is not about errors. Okay, variation is just about natural differences in the data. Okay. B, variation explains why the 40 plants will not all produce the exact same yield of corn despite having identical growing conditions. That sounds like a possible answer. C, variation is the specific mathematical process used to calculate the average yield of the sample. Well, variation is not a mathematical process, right? So, no. D, variation only occurs if the scientists use a biased sampling method to select the corn plants. It's also not a good answer. The answer here would definitely be B, all right? The other choices are not about variation. Variation is when we have just natural differences in data, just because that's the way the real world is. People aren't all the same height. Plants don't always produce the same yield. All right. There's just natural variance in the world. Okay. So that's a description of variance. All right. The next one, I'm just going to read through it, maybe give you a moment to see if you can identify the answer, and then I'll come back and answer it afterwards. So look at number 2 here. It says, a social scientist is curious about whether the use of digital textbooks improves student engagement compared to traditional print textbooks. They decide to follow the 4-step statistical investigative process. After they have formulated a research question and collected the data, what is the next logical step in the process? Is it A, interpreting the results to make a generalization about all students? B, analyzing the data by using graphs and numerical summaries? C, changing the research question to match the data that was gathered? Or D, determine the specific individuals and variables used in the study? So what do you think the answer is? Well, of course, we just talked about the 4-step investigative process. And after we formulate our research question, our investigative question, and after we collect the data, those are the first 2 steps, the 3rd step is to analyze. Remember, it's question, collect data, analyze, and then finally interpret the data. So the 3rd step is analyze. So I think the answer for this one is also B. All right, analyzing the data by using graphs and numerical summaries. All right, so that's topic 1.1. Quick introduction for you, and see you next time for topic 1.2.